Do you know that feeling of being the foundation of something great, yet watching your name vanish as if you never existed? It's like planting a tree with your own hands, watering it every day, shielding it from the wind and scorching sun, only to be treated as a mere accidental gardener when harvest time comes. Helen Moore knows this pain all too well. And if you're a mother, a father, or even someone who has ever sacrificed everything for those you love, this story will strike you deep. This isn't just about a woman betrayed by her own children. It's about a kind of betrayal you don't see in movies but feel in your skin, the invisible sacrifice, the one that sustains without applause, that loves without recognition. Helen gave every cent, every hour of sleep, every personal dream, and all of it turned to dust in the face of a bitter truth. The children she raised with so much love tried to erase her legacy as if it had never existed. But what no one expected was the turning point. Because when love is denied, emotional justice is born. And when pain turns into courage, confrontation becomes inevitable. Helen didn't want a stage, she only wanted respect. But since the party was theirs, she decided to join the script like the forgotten root of a facade empire. You're about to see, step by step, how a 73-year-old woman dismantled a million-dollar lie, faced the ingratitude of her children, and proved that love is not servitude. And above all, that public recognition is not a gift, it's the right of those who built with their own blood. Get ready for an intense journey, full of twists and lessons you'll never forget. If stories like this inspire you or make you reflect, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episodes. Now, let's begin. It wasn't just an invitation. It was the symbol of something much larger and much crueler. Helen Moore, at 73, held between her fingers an envelope made of thick paper, with golden details and carefully designed lettering. Celebration of the 5-year success of Claire Lucas Tech. Everything about it exuded prestige. Except for one thing: her name. Not a single line of acknowledgement. No mention of the woman who had mortgaged her own life for that company to exist. That wasn't just forgetfulness. It was a calculated erasure. And the feeling left behind was that of having been swept out of her own story. Imagine watching from a distance the celebration born from your own invisible sacrifice, like a disposable ex-employee. Helen looked at the invitation as if reading the headstone of an emotionally failed marriage. She didn't feel anger, yet only that silent knot in the chest that forms when injustice comes from where you least expect it. She remembered the time Claire had pneumonia and she stayed 3 sleepless nights in the hospital. Or the notebook where she wrote down every penny saved, skipping lunches and surviving on black coffee. Seeing her children shine on stage while her name was treated like a typo was a punch that not even age could soften. And the worst part? Everything was hidden behind fake smiles. Lucas spoke of resilience, Claire praised their humble roots, but neither seemed to recall the true foundation of that story. The marketing was beautiful, and it sold well. It sold the idea that they were self-made, as if success had sprouted from nowhere. Helen knew that speech. She had heard it on the radio, seen it on TV, read it in magazines. But to hear it from the mouths of her own children? It was like being run over by a false narrative built with her own bricks. Helen sat there, the invitation resting on her lap, in silence. The world around her kept spinning, but inside, something was starting to stir. It was still fragile, faint, like the flame of a candle in a dark room. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. She now understood with painful precision that the fancy piece of paper represented not just forgetfulness, but family betrayal. And not the loud kind, but the cold, sophisticated type that hides abandonment behind vague compliments and automatic invitations. And to her, that hurt more than a slap in the face. It's hard to explain what happens inside someone who has spent a lifetime putting others first. Those who love too much often believe everything is temporary, that one day they'll notice. But time offers no guarantees. Helen realized that waiting for recognition is like planting in dry soil without checking the weather. Love without reciprocity may bloom for a while, but one day it withers. And there, with that envelope between her fingers, she knew for certain love without acknowledgement is not love. It's servitude. The memories came in waves. She recalled the birthday when Lucas asked her not to come, because it was something more private. Or Claire's graduation, where her name was never mentioned in the thank you speech. Small cuts that, alone, seemed bearable, but together formed an emotional hemorrhage. And it was always like this: praises in public, distance in private. As if she had been useful for a while and now was just a burden they no longer knew how to carry. That night, Helen didn't cry. She sat on the porch, staring at the sky, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. But she wasn't searching for external culprits. On the contrary, her gaze turned inward. Had she erred by giving too much? By expecting too little? By never setting boundaries? The truth is, no one teaches us how to measure love. Especially when you're a mother. She didn't regret the care she gave, but she now understood that part of her pain came from her own concessions. And that was painful, but also liberating. She left the invitation on the table and walked inside. She knew that piece of paper marked the beginning of something new. The end of silence. A dividing line between naive love and mature awareness. The erased legacy wasn't just an oversight, it was the tip of an iceberg of her children's ingratitude that she could no longer ignore. And even without knowing yet what she would do, one thing was clear: she would no longer accept being a background character in the story she helped to write. The sound of rain tapping against the window was the perfect soundtrack for the memories flooding Helen's mind. Years earlier, that same house had been filled with the shouts of children, laughter echoing through the hallways, and sleepless nights. Widowed at 31, she found herself with 2 babies in her arms, a nurse's salary, and the crushing weight of a world that had no mercy for fragility. While friends moved on with their lives, traveled, remarried, Helen built a schedule of endless shifts that felt more like punishment than choice. And that's how, day after day, she wove what no one ever saw: the invisible sacrifice. It was waking at 4 in the morning to prepare bottles, and by 5 already standing at the bus stop. It was coming home only at night, still in a uniform stained with urgency, and finding her children asleep. She missed Lucas' first step. She missed Claire's first mommy. But she never complained. Because her dream was that they would have the choices she never had. That was what kept her going: not the paycheck, not the recognition, but love. Raw, unadorned love that endures in silence, content just to see her children grow, even without applause. What no one tells you is that this kind of love one day can swallow you whole. Every extra shift was a slice of her youth traded for diapers, vaccines, and tuition fees. Helen remembered the night she fainted at the hospital reception desk after an 18-hour shift, and when she woke, she apologized to her supervisor, as if it were her fault for having limits. She thought it was normal to give until exhaustion. After all, wasn't that what strong mothers did? But now she knew it wasn't strength. It was conditioning. A dangerous cycle where care becomes debt and silence becomes the rule. A cycle where love transforms into an invisible currency only she seemed to understand. Lucas and Claire had always been grateful. Or at least, they looked the part. They spoke of resilience, of growing up without a father, of the effort it took to get into college. But they never mentioned the cold meals Helen left in the microwave, or the worn-out shoes she kept wearing for years so they could have new sneakers. And the cruelest part? She didn't need them to build an altar. She only wanted, just once, to hear it was because of you. Instead, all she ever heard were speeches about independence and self-reliance, as if they had conquered everything on their own. On Sundays, while neighbors welcomed their children for family dinners, Helen grew used to silence. Family meals were replaced by quick voice messages and empty promises of "well, stop by sometime." And she accepted it. Not because she lacked love, but because she still clung to the hope that it was just a phase. That one day, her children would look back and understand what she had done. But time went on. And love without recognition grew heavier. What once was pride became doubt. Was loving this much really worth it when all she got in return was emptiness? She remembered the small joys she used to keep herself standing. Like buying a used book from the second-hand shop on the corner, just to escape between shifts. or writing down phrases in a notebook, jotting ideas for one day, maybe writing her memoirs. A day that never came. Because the present always demanded too much. And in that process, Helen disappeared. Not physically, but emotionally. It was as if she existed only as a function mother, nurse, caregiver. Her identity diluted into routine. And no one noticed. And whenever she thought about giving something to herself, a new urgency always appeared: Claire's tuition, Lucas' car repair, an overseas program. "I'll think about myself later," she used to say. But later never came. The $500,000 she would eventually invest in the startup was, in reality, just the formalization of a lifetime of unacknowledged giving. Helen had already given everything: time, youth, health. All that remained was money. And when even that was asked for, she gave it. Eyes closed. Because deep down, she still believed it was the last push her children needed to succeed. But now, reliving it all, the realization left a bitter taste. No one had ever stopped her from sacrificing. On the contrary, everyone had grown comfortable with it. Helen realized that what hurt wasn't how much she had given. It was that no one had ever said, "You don't have to." Her invisible sacrifice had become everyone else's convenience. And that, more than the fatigue or the loneliness, was what cut deepest. Because in the end, what she had given with love had been consumed as an obligation. And what she longed for in return, just a little consideration, seemed like a luxury no one was willing to offer. That rainy evening seemed to know what was coming. Helen was making tea, as she did every Monday, when the doorbell rang. Two familiar silhouettes appeared through the fogged glass. It was rare for both of them to show up together, unannounced. Lucas, with his brisk executive posture, and Claire, with the sweet tone she used whenever she needed something. Helen smiled, her heart tightening, thinking maybe, just maybe, they had come out of longing. But the moment she saw their faces, she realized there was tension in the air. An unease that betrayed the fact that this reunion had a script and she wasn't the author, only the audience. They sat in the living room, declined the tea. Their eyes wandered everywhere except toward her. Claire began speaking, praising the new project, explaining how the company was about to take a leap. Lucas added technical terms, projections, future profits. It sounded like a pitch to investors. Helen listened calmly, but the discomfort grew inside her. Until the central line dropped, "We need one last push, Mom." And then, as if dropping a bomb into her lap while trying to smile, Claire said, $500,000. Just a loan. You'll be a silent partner. The air left Helen's chest as though she'd been struck by an invisible blow. $500,000. Her entire life's savings. The money she had been tucking away for over 4 decades, penny by penny, since her husband's death. She looked at her children and realized they spoke with ease, as if the amount weren't absurd. More than that, as if the answer were already yes. Sitting before her were two people who had grown used to seeing their mother as an emotional and financial vault. And once again, they came to withdraw without ever checking the balance. Helen tried to reason. She asked if they had exhausted other possibilities, if they had spoken with investors or banks. Lucas replied, "No institution understands the emotional value of this business like you do." Claire added something about trusting family. And in that moment, without even realizing it, they had touched her weakest point. The word family had always been sacred to Helen. It was the very reason she breathed. And when she heard it, her rational side began to melt away. Because a mother's love doesn't know how to calculate. Deep down, no matter how hurt she was, she still wanted to see her children succeed. She still wanted to feel that, at least in this chapter, her presence was acknowledged. She asked for one night to think. She climbed the stairs alone and sat on the bed. Her eyes fell on the picture frame with her husband's photo, so young, so full of plans. She wondered how he would have handled this situation. And deep down, she knew he would have said yes too. But with one condition. So, the next day, Helen did what she had always done best: she yielded. She transferred the $500,000 and asked for only one thing: that her name be listed as a partner, even a silent one. She didn't want dividends, titles, or applause. She only wanted to be part of the story she was helping to write. It was little. It was fair. Or at least, she thought so. The receipt of the transfer was tucked away in a blue folder at the back of her closet. It was the final symbol of a lifetime of invisible investment. That money didn't just represent numbers. It represented sleepless nights, difficult decisions, endless sacrifices. It represented the sneakers she never bought, the car she never replaced, the vacations she never took. And now, all of that was in the hands of two adults who had become entrepreneurs on a foundation they had never truly known. Helen took a deep breath and tried to convince herself that everything was fine. But something inside her, perhaps for the first time, didn't believe it anymore. In the days that followed, Helen tried to feel like she was part of it. She asked how the negotiations were going, if they needed help with anything. But the answers were brief, hollow. "Everything's going well, Mom. It's hectic. I'll tell you later." Her children's excitement vanished as quickly as it had appeared. And she began to realize that the request hadn't been a bridge, it had been a severance. She had stopped being a mother and had become a resource. And the silence after the transfer was louder than any argument could ever be. Alone on the porch, watching the rain that refused to stop, Helen finally understood what had happened. She hadn't been invited to take part in a dream. She had been used to finance one. And there, with her heart heavy and her mind painfully clear, she realized what lay ahead was not gratitude, not shared success. What awaited her was the beginning of an irreversible distance. The inevitable confrontation was still far off, but the seeds had already been planted, watered by silent tears and a wound that grew deeper with every passing day. At first, Helen tried to excuse the silence. They must be busy, she told herself as she watched her phone sit untouched for days. She sent messages asking how they were, receiving only short replies, "All good, Mom. Kiss." Her heart always tried to overlook it. After all, it had been like this for years, her giving everything, them showing up occasionally. But now something was different. It wasn't just absence. It was disconnection. And worse, indifference disguised as hurry. The children who once begged for her embrace now acted as if a simple thanks had settled a lifelong debt. Helen began noticing the details. Before, Lucas used to call when he closed an important contract. Claire would send voice notes about her business trips. Now, everything was vague. "I'll tell you later." "We'll set a time eventually." And the most painful part? They only seemed to remember her when some bureaucratic decision involved their father's name. Nothing personal. Just function. Just convenience. Once again, her invisible sacrifice became a footnote, faceless, voiceless. She tried to reconnect. Suggested dinner. A coffee. A Sunday together. There was always an excuse. "We're drowning in meetings. The European investor is here." Until one day, Helen overheard from a neighbor that Lucas had hosted a gala dinner with the company's main partners. Only the founders were there, the neighbor said, excited. Helen smiled politely, but inside she felt the weight of those words. She wasn't on the list. And in that moment, she understood with brutal clarity that she was being erased systematically. Photos of the event soon appeared on social media. Claire and Lucas smiling, toasting with businessmen, presenting slides with inspirational quotes. Helen stopped on one image in particular, the two of them holding a symbolic trophy, with the caption 5 years of vision, courage, and independence. That last word echoed in her mind like a subtle insult. Independence? Who paid the price for this so-called freedom? Who funded the flight that now served to deny the very runway it took off from? She spent days in silence. It wasn't drama. It was reflection. Helen had always believed that time revealed everything. But now she saw that sometimes, time only confirmed what the heart already knew. Her children weren't busy, they were simply too comfortable with the distance. Contact became protocol. Messages turned into announcements. And she, once essential, had become an inconvenient presence that might tarnish the image of self-made resilience they were selling to the world. The family betrayal hadn't come with shouting. It came with smiles and exclusion. Still, Helen hesitated to blame. Part of her kept searching for internal explanations. Was I too strict when they were little? Did I ask too little of them? But it was impossible to ignore the facts. And even more, the coldness with which everything unfolded. The cruelest realization was that her children had grown accustomed to the idea that she would always be there. Available, silent, loving. A mother without demands, without conditions, without a name on the company's door. A silent partner not just in business but in life. One random afternoon, Lucas showed up quickly to pick up some documents. He didn't come inside. He didn't ask how she was. He just grabbed the envelope and left. Helen closed the door slowly and sat on the couch. She didn't cry. But she also couldn't bring herself to get up for hours. For the first time, she understood that this house was no longer part of their lives. It was just a base they kept out of moral obligation. And her presence, once essential, was now treated as an interference that needed to be kept at arm's length. That was when something shifted inside her. It wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, steady awakening. Helen began to realize that what hurt wasn't the physical distance. It was the emotional erasure. She didn't want exaggerated gratitude, nor spotlights. She just wanted truth. And deep down, she knew that if she kept accepting their version of events, her story would be buried alive. And it was there, in the shadows of a silent house, that she began to prepare herself not to demand, but to reclaim what had been taken from her without permission, her place in the story. It happened on an ordinary afternoon that the truth came crashing in. Helen was at the supermarket when she ran into Daniel, an old family friend, one of those people who watched from afar but always knew the essentials. Between small talk and smiles, he enthusiastically mentioned the new round of investments that Claire and Lucas' company had just secured. "You must be so proud, Helen. Your name is behind all of this, isn't it?" She smiled politely. But inside, something felt wrong. Proud she was. But behind. Yes, literally. And maybe, entirely off the record. That very night, restless, she decided to investigate. She had never done this before. She had always trusted her children, never felt the need. But the unease was growing. She logged onto the Securities Commission website and searched for the company's name. The process was simple, almost banal. But what she found was anything but ordinary. Official documents, meeting minutes, shareholder records, transfers. And not a single one carried her name. Not as an investor, not as a silent partner. It was as if the 500,000 had never existed. As if she had never existed. Helen read and reread the documents. Double-checked the names. Cross-referenced the company IDs. Nothing. Claire and Lucas appeared as the only founders. There were records of strategic meetings, profit distributions, restructuring agreements. Everything impeccably formal. Everything intentionally exclusive. This wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. An institutionalized erasure. And in that moment, she felt a chill down her spine that no personal betrayal had ever caused before. Because this wasn't just hurt. It was fraud. It was deception. It was her children's ingratitude stamped and legalized. She didn't sleep that night. She rummaged through old folders, bank statements, old emails. She found the transfer receipt. She found Claire's thank you message. She even found a note in her own handwriting: investment for my children's future, 100 trust. Reading those words broke her heart all over again. It wasn't just about money. It was about what the money represented. It was the final offering of a woman who had spent her entire life waiting for the moment she would finally be seen. And all she received in return was legalized silence. But there, in the middle of pain, something new was born. Helen began printing every piece of evidence, numbering receipts, making copies. She didn't cry. She was focused. Like someone who finds, among the rubble, the key to a door they never knew they needed to open. Organizing those papers became almost a ritual. With every item filed, she felt her strength return. With every folder created, a part of her self-esteem came back to life. What began as humiliation was turning into clarity. And this time, not to save anyone, but to save herself. In the following days, she dove deeper. She studied laws, read similar cases, watched hours of legal videos. She discovered that there was a path. And, more importantly, that there were ways to make her story visible again. For the first time, it wasn't about trying to win her children back, it was about winning herself back. And that changed everything. What had been a wound was now a spark. What had been submission was now movement. The narrative was shifting. And Helen, for the very first time, was beginning to write the next chapter with her own hands. She called David Turner, an old friend of her late husband, and told him everything. David was discreet but firm. He told her that yes, there were options. Yes, she could claim her rights. And more importantly, that she wasn't crazy. What she was feeling was real, and it was valid. Helen cried, but this time out of relief. For the first time in years, someone looked at her as part of the story, not as a background character. David recommended a trusted attorney. Helen wrote down the name Laura Benson. And in that instant, she knew from here on, nothing would ever be the same again. But it wasn't just about legal justice. It was deeper. Helen wanted emotional justice. She wanted to restore her identity, her value, her voice. It wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming a name her own children had tried to erase. And now, with proof in her hands, professional support by her side, and a pain that had transformed into strength, she was ready. Not to attack, but to stand tall before the world and say, I exist. And you will remember that. The following days were silent, but not empty. Helen woke early, poured herself a strong cup of coffee, and immersed herself in the folders she had carefully assembled with surgical precision. Before, her routine had been filled with unanswered phone calls and lonely dinners. Now, every minute had a purpose. Organizing receipts, transcribing messages, printing and laminating emails, all of it became an exercise in reclamation. It was like rebuilding a story with her own hands. A story that had been stolen, edited, reduced. But now it was reborn, with a firm voice and capital letters. It wasn't just about formalizing evidence. It was a process of healing. Every archived item, every line written in her journal was also a conversation with the past. Helen wrote letters. Some addressed to her children. Others to herself. Some to her late husband. In those letters, she poured out her sorrows but also rediscovered her strength. She confessed fears she had never admitted, not even out loud. And for the first time, she stopped asking herself what she had done wrong. She began asking why she tolerated so much. And the answer was always the same: out of love. But now, she saw that love without acknowledgement is love that dissolves. Little by little, the feeling of victimhood was replaced by clarity. She no longer saw her children as villains, but as adults who had made choices. Bad choices. Cruel choices. But choices she was no longer obligated to cover up. The silence she had kept for so long wasn't noble. It was complicit. And by realizing that, Helen freed herself from an unjust pact. Her invisible sacrifice would no longer be currency for anyone. And that was more than a decision, it was a turning point. With the support of David and attorney Laura, she assembled a complete timeline. From the very first deposit to the social events where she had been ignored. Every detail fit together like pieces of a cruel puzzle. And as the narrative took shape in the documents, something was happening inside her. Helen sat straighter in her chair. She began laughing to herself again. She regained her taste for writing. Her tired face gave way to an expression that mixed pain with conviction. She was no longer the woman begging for attention. She was the woman demanding respect. And with evidence. David, always discreet, suggested that the best way to reveal the truth would be in a symbolic moment. You don't just want to win. You want to be heard, he said. And he was right. Helen didn't want to destroy her children. She wanted everyone to see what had really happened. She wanted to restore what had been denied to her, the right to be part of her own story. That's when the idea came up. The 5-year anniversary party of the company. All the partners, investors, the press, the guests. A stage set up, but this time, with a new script. A script where she would appear not as a spectator, but as the author of the introduction. In the days that followed, Helen rehearsed. Not just words, but posture, presence. She started walking around the block again, cut her hair, and set aside a dress she had kept for years, the one she had worn at her late husband's last birthday. Not to look younger, but to remind herself of the woman she had always been. The woman who faced overcrowded hospitals, overdue bills, sick children, and never backed down. That was the woman who would step onto the stage, not the erased mother, not the silent partner, but the voice that refused to die in silence. With each letter written, Helen was also writing a manifesto of dignity. There was no more room for doubt. If before she feared being seen as resentful, now she understood demanding justice is not revenge. It is self-respect. And more than that, it is an act of empowerment, of confrontation. What she was about to do was not against her children. It was for herself. And for all the other Helens around the world who had given everything and received only oblivion in return. On the eve of the party, Helen slept little. But she slept in peace. Her bag was ready. The documents, numbered. The speech, memorized. The dress, hanging. And in the place of bitterness, there was an unshakable certainty: my name will echo in that room. The story would not end in silence. It would end in truth. And truth, as Helen was about to show, can be ignored for a while but not forever. The first meeting with Laura Benson took place on a Saturday morning, in a modest office downtown. No marble floors, no glamorous receptionists. Just a quiet room, the smell of fresh coffee, and shelves packed with case files. Laura was young, but her eyes were steady and her voice calm. She listened to Helen intently, without interruption. In the end, she took the documents and said, "You have a solid case, Helen. And you have something even rarer, the truth." It felt like a seal of validation. For the first time, someone saw her not as a bitter old woman, but as a woman seeking emotional justice. David, for his part, wasn't much of a talker. But he knew the corporate game better than most. He was the one who suggested the approach: not to file a lawsuit right away, but to present the facts in front of everyone, in the most symbolic setting possible, the company's anniversary party. The impact will be emotional, not just legal, he explained. Helen hesitated. She knew it wouldn't be easy to expose herself. But she realized it was the only way to break the cycle of silence. To show that her pain had a date, a form, and a signature. That she had always existed in the shadows of it all. They began working together. David handled the strategies, Laura the documents, and Helen her own preparation. They sent formal notices to the company, requesting clarification on her exclusion as a partner. No response came. Laura smiled even better. "It'll only strengthen our narrative." The case grew, but without scandal. It was a silent, precise movement. And the more her children ignored it, the stronger Helen became. The irony was perfect: invisibility was now working in her favor. The three of them defined everything with precision: the time, the place, the order of speeches. Helen would have only 5 minutes, enough to present the facts, show the documents, and declare, "I am the forgotten root of this company." David would take care of filming. Laura would be among the investors. No noise, no spectacle. Just the truth stepping into the spotlight at the exact moment. And Helen knew there would be no second chance. That's why she rehearsed every word, like someone rehearsing the reunion with her own identity. In the middle of it all, Helen did something that surprised even Laura. She wrote a letter to Claire and Lucas. Not to soften their hearts, but so that, in the future, They could never say she hadn't tried to reach out. The letter was direct, no exaggerated resentment, no emotional blackmail. It simply said, I asked for respect. You chose silence. Now, I choose to be heard. And at the end, she signed as never before, Helen Moore, investor and silent founder. Until now. David was moved when he read the letter. He said that if it were a movie, that line would be the turning point. But real life, Helen knew, didn't come with a soundtrack. It came with courage. And courage was something she had in abundance. With every meeting, with every adjustment to the plan, she felt less like an abandoned mother and more like a woman aware of her own worth. She no longer needed recognition in the form of affection. Now she sought recognition as reparation. And that was something no one could deny her anymore. In the days leading up to the event, Helen revisited old places. The hospital where she had worked. Her children's school. The bank where she had opened her first savings account. Each place told a piece of the story that was about to be revealed. She took notes, recalled phrases, connected memories. And with that, she built not just a defense, but a manifesto. An undeniable narrative that the success of Claire Lucas Tech had not sprung from nothing. It had been born from the womb of a woman who had decided she would remain silent no longer. And so, with the plan aligned, her allies in position, and the past finally put in order, Helen was ready. Not to fight, but to present herself. To finally step into, in front of everyone, the place that had always been hers. A place that had never been given but that she was about to claim with dignity. That week, Helen took 3 days for herself. She turned off her phone, refused visitors, stopped even responding to her lawyer's emails. She needed silence. Time for herself. It was in that quiet that she chose the dress. A navy blue model, classic, discreet, yet commanding. The very same she had worn the day she was promoted as head of the emergency ward, decades earlier. A garment that symbolized not only a professional achievement, but a time when she had still been seen as a person, not as a utility. That dress would be her armor. In the mirror, she observed herself carefully. The wrinkles told stories. The eyes, though tired, still carried life. Her hair, neatly tied back, completed the look. Helen wasn't chasing youth. She was chasing firmness. And in that reflection, she found exactly that. It wasn't vanity. It was a silent declaration that she would not walk onto that stage as someone broken. She would arrive as someone whole, in the midst of rebuilding. She organized the documents into 3 folders. One with the financial proof. Another with the messages exchanged with her children. And the third with the letter she had written, printed copies on sturdy paper, signed at the end. It wasn't just a dossier. It was the story no one had wanted to hear. And now, it would be spoken aloud. She also prepared a small flash drive with everything digitized. David carried 1 copy. Laura, another. It was the precaution of someone who knew the value of memory when the truth bothers those who would rather forget. On the eve of the event, Helen felt no fear. She felt focus. She recited aloud every part of what she would say. She emphasized words, practiced pauses, adjusted her tone. But more than anything, she practiced the silence after the impact. She knew the room would react. Some in shock. Others in denial. But she didn't need anyone's approval. She only needed to be heard. And with that thought, she slept. For the first time in weeks, she slept with serenity. Because the woman who would wake the next morning was no longer just a mother. She was both witness and protagonist. On the morning of the event, Helen arrived early. She took in the hall, the flower arrangements, the stage. Nothing there felt familiar, even though everything had been built from pieces of her own story. It was like walking into a play performed with her script, but without her permission. And instead of intimidating her, that only strengthened her presence. Every detail was a reminder that lies had their stage but truth was about to steal the scene. Laura met her outside and squeezed her hand firmly. "This is your moment, Helen." David, with a discreet smile, handed her an envelope with the speeches of the children, had managed to get a copy beforehand. She read silently until she came across the sentence that made her stop. This company is the result of two determined minds who never depended on anyone. That was when Helen realized the lie was complete. And it had to be dismantled in front of everyone. She went up to the improvised dressing room and said one last prayer. Not to ask for strength, but to give thanks. To herself. For the courage not to accept oblivion as destiny. For the audacity to interrupt the cycle of silence. For understanding that legacy is only worth something when it carries the right names. And hers was one of those names. When the event began, Helen sat in the second row. Discreet, but present. Her children, on stage, didn't see her right away. And she didn't want them to. She wanted the right moment. The exact hour. Because that night, it wouldn't be a shout that spoke the loudest. It would be the story. And the story was about to acknowledge its true author. The hall was packed. Cameras at the back, waiters carrying trays, foreign investors, smiling faces, endless selfies. The event was a showcase of success. The twins' company was about to announce a multimillion-dollar merger. Claire opened the speeches with enthusiasm, thanking the team, highlighting the family values that brought us here. Lucas took over next, with sharp oratory, mentioning obstacles overcome and strategic partnerships. Everything perfectly rehearsed. Except for what was about to happen. Helen waited for the right moment, like someone holding lightning in her fist. She stood up calmly, papers in hand, and walked toward the stage. The gazes turned in slow motion. At first, no one understood. It looked like part of the program. But when Helen took the microphone from her son's hands, the atmosphere in the room shifted. An absolute silence fell. Claire muttered, "Mom, please," but stopped when she saw her mother's eyes. Eyes that weren't asking permission. Eyes that declared, "Now, you will listen." Helen took a deep breath. And began. "Good evening. My name is Helen Moore. Perhaps you've heard that name, perhaps not. But it should be on every single slide you've seen today. Because without it, this company would not exist." A murmur rippled through the audience. Those closest began to record. She continued, firm. "5 years ago, my children came to my house asking for a loan. $500,000. My entire life's savings. In return, they promised me partnership. A share. Respect. I didn't ask for a salary. I didn't ask for power. I only asked to be included. And today, I discover I have been erased." She raised the folder. "Here are the bank transfers. The messages. The proof. My name was never registered. I never existed for the company I built with blood, exhaustion, and love." The audience was stunned. Some looked at Claire and Lucas, waiting for a reaction. They were pale. They tried to smile, to wave it off, to deny with their eyes. But nothing could erase the scene. Helen stood before everyone, not as a bitter old woman, but as the denied root now blooming at the center of the stage. "I didn't come here to ask for apologies. Or symbolic recognition. I came to declare that I am the forgotten foundation of this empire. And I refuse to remain a spectator of what I helped build." As she spoke, Helen handed the folders to one of the legal representatives present. "These documents have also been submitted to the SEC. And the truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that there is no legitimate success when it is born from a lie. And this lie ends here." The impact was total. An uneasy silence spread across the room. And then the first round of applause began. From the back. Slow but firm. Investors exchanged glances, visibly uncomfortable. One of the representatives from the company evaluating the merger discreetly left the room. The press, which had been there only to cover a celebration, turned all their cameras toward Helen. And at that moment, she wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She stood tall. She was the living image of recovered dignity. She had broken the cycle. and done what no one expected, taken back the stage that was hers by right. Lucas tried to approach, but she stepped back with elegance. "Not now," she said. Claire fought back tears, but didn't say a word. Because deep down, she knew everything Helen had said was true. For years, they had pretended she was just support. Now the whole world knew that without her, there would be no structure, no company, no celebration. And that truth, spoken before everyone, was more powerful than any lawsuit. Helen stepped down from the stage under the gaze of an audience torn between shock and admiration. The truth wasn't comfortable, but it was liberating. And as she crossed the hall, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: lightness. Not because everything was resolved, but because, for the first time, she no longer carried the weight of the story alone. The aftermath was immediate. Before Helen even got home that night, the videos were already circulating on social media. Clips of her speech went viral with captions like "the mother who funded a company and was erased" and "the true face behind the success of Claire Lucas Tech." Influencers, lawyers, and even business columnists began commenting on the case. In less than 24 hours, what had been planned as a celebration had turned into a crisis. And not just an internal crisis, it was a moral crisis, with a name, a face, and documented proof. The company, until then wrapped in prestige, was suddenly placed under suspicion. Investors started making public statements. One of the main international funds that had been negotiating the acquisition suspended all talks. "We are re-evaluating the company's ethical commitment to its founders and investors," their official note read. The press, sensing a story, dug deeper. They discovered that Helen's name had never once been mentioned in any official statements. It was as if she had never existed. But now, the entire world knew she was the origin. The following day, the Securities and Exchange Commission issued a statement confirming the opening of a formal investigation. Helen's complaint, with all the attached documents, had already been filed officially. The possible omission of information about the origin of capital and the deliberate exclusion of a founding investor amounted, in theory, to corporate fraud. This wasn't just public shame. It was real legal risk. Lucas tried to calm things down with a cold statement, calling it a family misunderstanding. But it was too late. The damage was done. And for the first time, the public was on Helen's side. Television programs invited Helen for interviews. Articles began to circulate analyzing the case and praising her courage. "The silence of mothers builds empires, but their cry can bring kingdoms down," read one of the most shared pieces. And unexpectedly, other women began to speak up. Similar stories surfaced: mothers who had loaned money, taken care of grandchildren, given up retirement and then were discarded without acknowledgement. Without intending to, Helen had become a symbol. An example of mature empowerment, of someone who decided that growing old doesn't mean disappearing. Claire tried to reach out. She called, sent messages, even sent flowers. But Helen didn't respond. She knew those gestures came more from desperation than repentance. And in that moment, she wasn't seeking reconciliation. She was seeking reparation, justice, respect. Lucas, on the other hand, reached out to Laura, asking to resolve this amicably. The response was straightforward: any resolution begins with public recognition of Mrs. Moore's role. At last, the children's pride was being forced to face what they had avoided for years: reality. Inside the company, tension spread. Employees whispered about the videos in private groups. Some admitted feeling ashamed for never having heard Helen's name. Others expressed admiration for her strength. The marketing team tried to bury the story, but the damage was done. Because what was at stake was no longer just a legal matter. It was an open ethical wound, laid bare before thousands of people. And trying to cover it up only proved the very point Helen had exposed: the problem wasn't forgetfulness. It was deliberate erasure. Helen followed everything with serenity. She wasn't seeking fame. She didn't want the role of heroine. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing her voice had finally reached where it needed to. Not by shouting, but by standing firm. By telling the truth. And by being living proof that justice, even late, can echo louder than hollow recognition. The game had turned. And those who tried to rewrite the story in their own way would now have to face the original author returning to the center of the narrative. 2 days after the confrontation, Claire showed up at her mother's house. Red eyes, a low voice, and a barely disguised plea for reconciliation. "We can resolve this, Mom, without scandal." But Helen, calm, replied, "Resolving without recognition is just perpetuating the mistake." There was no more room for guilt-ridden hugs. What she wanted wasn't an apology. It was respect, and respect is not begged for, it is demanded. Lucas didn't have the courage to appear. He sent a legal representative instead. Helen simply forwarded him to the attorney. The time of polite coffees was over. The good memories weren't erased, but they had been placed in their rightful place. The past. The relationship with her children hadn't ended. It had simply been redefined under new terms: truth, boundaries, and dignity. Helen understood now that to love doesn't mean to accept everything. And that saying no is also a way of teaching. More than a wounded mother, she had become a mirror for thousands of women who had given everything and learned, too late, that love without a voice is a prison. With public pressure and undeniable proof, the company made it official. Helen Moore's name was now listed as a founder. Silently, she looked at the document. She didn't smile with revenge. She smiled with peace. Finally, she existed. Publicly, legally, morally. She refused financial compensation and instead created a scholarship in her husband's name, helping other women not to remain invisible the way she had been. She turned pain into continuity, silence into action, and solitude into an example. Her children now looked at her differently. Claire sought reconnection with more listening than words. Lucas, through a letter, admitted his mistakes. "Today I see you. It was too late for many repairs. But never too late for the truth. And the truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again." Helen, at last, rested. Not out of exhaustion, but out of justice. The world had tried to erase her name. And she had written it back through voice, through courage, and through the kind of love that refuses to bow to ingratitude. The story of Helen Moore is not just about a name omitted from a contract. It is about what happens when love is given without measure but received with calculation. When sacrifice is treated as obligation. When someone's blood, sweat, and years become invisible because those who received too much learned to see too little. Helen didn't want revenge. She wanted memory. She wanted her effort to have a face, a date, a record. Because deep down, every mother who loves dreams of recognition, not with statues, but with gestures. With a look that says, "I know what you did for me." And what this story shows us, with brutal tenderness, is that sometimes that look never comes. But even so, we can and must rise. Helen teaches us that it is possible to begin again at 73. That emotional justice can and should be sought. That saying enough may hurt, but it also liberates. And that no matter how hard it is, reclaiming your own name is a way of saving not only yourself, but everyone who comes after you. The truth can be delayed, but never buried forever. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone or of yourself, share it. Subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this need to be told, retold, and, above all, recognized.